It's good to have Jonathan Durand on the show. He is a documentary filmmaker and photographer. He's currently making a documentary about Ukraine, I believe. But we're here to discuss his previous film project, Memory is Our Homeland. John, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well. Like you in Budapest, it's a bit rainy today, but I kind of like it. It's good for getting work done.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the rain. It's indoor weather, so I think that's understandable.
Yeah.
So I was introduced to you by the musician Peggy Hogan, also a resident of Montreal. She goes by
hmm
Wally. So how did you guys know each other?
Oh, that is a good question. I don't remember exactly when I met Peggy, but it's been quite a long time now, probably about 15 years we've known each other.
Oh,
So yeah, we have a group of friends in common and ended up just becoming quite close over the years.
that's wonderful. Yeah,
Yeah.
I met her some 3 years ago on this very show. So yeah, glad to make new friends on the podcast.
Yeah, you seem to be meeting a lot of interesting people through this project.
Certainly, yes. I try to broaden the mind, so to speak.
hmm
Yeah, tell me about your current project on Ukraine.
Well, in 2022, a couple weeks after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I traveled to Warsaw initially to help with volunteer efforts. The idea was to just go help how I could. Through my last film, I guess we'll talk about that. I have quite a close relationship with Poland. I've been there many times. And because of the nature of the work I was doing, looking into my own family history, I felt compelled to go and help. So pretty quickly, I went from being in Warsaw to being in Krakow to being at the Ukrainian border and then making trips into Ukraine. And I guess, like to put it very, very briefly, it's a film about volunteers and volunteerism. What is it that's driving certain people to go and help, against their own self-interest often, typically, actually? And what is it that separates them from, or makes them stand out from what's a pretty cynical, transactional era we're living in? So I followed an ambulance about a year ago, February 2024. I followed an ambulance that was a convoy of ambulances being donated from Amsterdam to the front. And along the way, interviewed the volunteers and yeah, I've continued the project of interviewing people who, in different capacities, are contributing to the war effort in Ukraine or outside of Ukraine.
That's it. I look forward to when the project comes out. Do you have a name for it yet?
Right now, the working title is The Inner Light, which, the idea is to sort of look at whatever it is that's inside of certain people that's, some kind of light that's coming from inside of them as opposed to from the outside.
Hmm.
Might change, but for now, I like the title. I have to see if there are any other documentaries that have the same title.
Certainly. Yeah. And do you know the release date yet?
No, that's contingent on a lot of factors, but probably I'm hoping to be done this fall, so by next spring. So in about a year is my hope.
Okay. Well, I hope to meet you back here again to discuss it.
Would like
Yeah.
that.
So to segue into our topic of the hour, so what is the historical relationship between the Ukrainians and the Polish people, to your knowledge?
Well, okay, so you're starting with a very light, easygoing question that doesn't have any, loaded weight to it. Okay, so, for those who know the history of Eastern Europe, I don't need to get too much into the history, but Poland and Ukraine are neighbors, right? So Poland is kind of famous historically for being caught, between Russia and Germany, and that sort of is something that defines its history, right? Is the geography being placed between those two, very large countries, which over in the sense that it's between the two countries and has its own independent histories of Poland and Russia. So, I could, without getting too much into the history, there's been a lot of very, close ties over history and also periods of bloodshed and, conflict between Poland and Ukraine or between Poles and Ukrainians. Like my grandmother moved to Canada in 1954 after the war, after going through her journey. She came from England to Montreal in 1954. She was a very sweet woman. She got along with most people, but I remember when I had, in high school, my first girlfriend, my first serious girlfriend, was Ukrainian. Her parents or grandparents were, and my grandmother, made some comment in the communities. But, since the full-scale invasion, that's actually changed a lot because of the role that Poland had and has continued to have in supporting Ukraine and Ukrainians. So it's actually opened up the opportunity for a lot of very meaningful conversations about history and about some of the more
Yeah, I think we got cut off a bit. So can you?
Oh yeah, okay. I'm not sure where I stopped, but
Yeah. I
just
think you mentioned a bit about like how your first serious girlfriend is Ukrainian, and then it
right.
just starts there.
That's my grandmother coming in and sending a message because I'm making a comment like, dating a Ukrainian girl. And I was like, what does that mean? So it's sort of in a country like Canada, we're not really tied to these conflicts and histories from, quote unquote, the old country. But yeah, I remember really striking me that my grandmother made this comment. But yeah, suffice it to say that Poland and Ukraine have a very, complicated relationship. Like if that were the relationship status on Facebook or whatever it would be, it's complicated.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm actually reading a current book on, was it Eastern European history? I'm sure you're familiar with this one. Iron
Yep.
Curtain by Anne Applebaum. She covered
Obama.
Poland a bit. I think she has like dual Polish citizenship as well as American. And I think what, the commonality between Polish and Ukrainian history is that for a time, both were under the umbrella of the USSR and both suffered the brunt of that particular form of oppression. So I believe in today's this geopolitical age, both find it there's a common sympathy of both against Russian invasion.
Oh, you got cut off there a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So where was I?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Yeah, you got a little bit cut off. But yeah, the last thing I caught was that you're saying that there's a common sort of or shared sympathy between Poland and Ukraine with respect to
Yeah.
USSR and
Yeah.
that history. That is true. There's a sort of nostalgia or nostalgia, as they call it, like Eastern for the Soviet Union. But there was a lot of very catastrophic repression, and a lot of that did end up coming out against national minorities. And Ukraine has a very specific role in Russian history, and there was extra repression on them, and that continues today.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is the genesis of your documentary, Memories Our Homeland?
Um, I mean, it's funny because the film it sort of explains the whole story. The film itself, is the story of
Yeah.
how the film got made. But it's on the one hand, like I see in the film, I was a small child, and I remember distinctly being in my grandmother's house in Montreal and her telling me about Africa. And I was sitting over an encyclopedia, like a children's illustrated encyclopedia that showed the continents and all the different animals, lions and giraffes and elephants and whatever, and across Africa. And I remember my grandmother sort of standing over my shoulder and pointing down next to this big mountain that I would come to understand was Kilimanjaro. And she pointed to the map and said, "That's where Babcia grew up. Like that's where I grew up." I took it completely for granted that, a Polish grandmother could grow up in Africa. To me, it was normal that's where she would grow up because that's all I knew. It was only when I got older and went to university and studied political science and history and started becoming more curious about, my family's past that it, became clearer that the history was really unknown and that, kind of was shown in a moment where a professor of mine responded to something that I commented in a paper that I'd done for the class. He's like, Polish refugees in Africa. I don't know about that. I'm not sure. So it created this conflict for me between, the written history that I was being taught at McGill, one of the best universities in Canada and the world, and the story that I'd grown up with as oral history through my grandmother and other people. So that was sort of the genesis of it. And then years later, after I finished university, I ended up doing some like development work in South Africa and Mozambique. And that's when I really started to get curious because then I would go see these traditional villages with round huts and banana thatch leaves as roofs, and I'd be like, that's actually the type of house that my grandmother grew up in. Actually, I have a photo here of it.
Mhm.
So, that's my grandmother in the doorway, right? And this is the home in Tanzania that she spent her adolescence in. So as a kid, I took it completely for granted that my grandmother grew up here. But then when I got older, I started to understand that that image is outside of history, really, or outside of the history that we know or that we're taught. So it's sort of the genesis of it, like, my curiosity in where I came from.
Yeah. So tell me about the inclusion of the epigraph that begins the film. It's by writer and journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski. I
Yeah,
hope
you
I
got it.
pronounced that correctly. But
Richard,
you're welcome to explain it because I cannot quote it, verbatim by memory.
I think I have that book in my I know I have it somewhere in my library, but yeah, it's a quote from Ryszard Kapuscinski, who's, quite a very well-known, very famous Polish journalist. He was sort of the first journalist under the communist regime to be issued sorry about that. He was the first journalist under the communist regime to be issued an international press pass. So he ended up traveling all across Africa in particular, documenting the independence movements in the 1960s. So Richard Kapuscinski, very credible journalist, very respected for his work, but he had a very specific style, which combined factual reporting, but with like really almost poetic, I mean, it is poetic details, very human detailing. And his style really appealed to me when I was younger and learning about Poland because I like to call it Slavic magic realism because it's got this like element to it of magic and mystery. So the epigraph that starts the film, basically is a reference to the fact that the history of, in that case, he's talking about people across Africa, the tradition of oral history. You can't find that history in books, or you couldn't at the time he was there. So Kapuscinski is referring to the fact that Africa has a history of, or tradition of oral history and storytelling. And it really struck me that, not only did I come from a family whose history was living almost exclusively in storytelling and in oral history, but that, it had also been erased and that I couldn't find traces of it. And on top of that, it was a history that was connected to Africa. So that quote really stuck out to me, the way that it kind of like drew these intersections. It sort of pulled these separate threads together for me and helped me clarify the story I was trying to tell.
Yeah. Speaking of Poland, have you seen the movie A Real Pain by Jesse Eisenberg?
I have. Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think of it?
I watched it with my partner who's not Eastern European, has no connection to it. And we had different reactions. I mean, she appreciated it as a film. I was, in tears a few times in it because it really reminded me of being younger and traveling to Poland for the first time, in 2010. It was, I can't remember, but I was younger and I was, I'd never been to Poland. Nobody in my family had ever gone back to Poland. No family had been pushed out of. So yeah, it's I think he does a good job. Yeah, it's good storytelling. The only thing is that there aren't enough fractions with actual polls, I'd say, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that would be like one significant complaint I have too, but the movie's what 90 or so minutes long, so they can only focus on so much. Yeah, I remember it's one of those few movies that I saw it in theaters, and it's one of the few movies that really made me cry. There was this one scene where the tour guide was they were walking in a group through the streets of Lublin, I believe, and he said that, back in the day, this place was like the hub of, great intellectual and artistic flourishing. And he mentions that there were cafes and there were synagogues, and you have the present day scenes. They're just houses and streets and street corners.
Mhm.
So it's a real gut-wrenching reminder of what was lost in history, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, and my grandfather was from Lublin and went through the concentration camp system. He passed away before I was born, so I never got to hear his story directly from him. But we have a direct family connection to Lublin, so that also kind of hit me because I've been to Lublin. I've walked through those streets that you're talking about. If you keep your eyes open, you can sort of read the signs, across the city. A word that I really like is palimpsest,
Mhm.
which refers to writing that has sort of been erased and written over top of. And yeah, that I think you find across Poland and definitely in Lublin. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think you've addressed something, quite historically extraordinary is that the relationship between ethnic Poles and Jews of Poland. I understand
Mhm.
that, yeah, to some extent that may be even more difficult to unravel than that between the Polish and the Ukrainians.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, it's a very complicated history. I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic high school in Ottawa. So the kids who surrounded me were all Christian, or at least nominally Christian. It's only when I came to Montreal and went to McGill that I started having Jewish friends. All of a sudden, it was very strange to me because it was like this, my closest friends were suddenly all Jewish. And in one case, there's a friend. I made, she and I became very, very close and we've stayed in touch. We're still friends. But at 18, 19, like I was talking about Polish history from the history of Polish Gentiles or Catholics or whatever, but with connections to the concentration camps and everything. And she was telling the story of, her family going through them as Jews. And, it was really such a valuable friendship for me to be able to like reconcile those perspectives over time. Because
Yeah,
that's what it takes, I think, is those, those difficult conversations and being able to admit that you don't have a full picture, that you have to listen to, another person tell their story.
of course. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm a Catholic person. I was a convert. I did was baptized 3 years ago, and I think it is certainly extraordinarily hard if you are talking to like a really religiously committed Jewish
Mhm.
person, because again, the history of Jewish-Christian relations have not been the best, and of course, it's even more difficult because the nation state of the Jewish people is undergoing what is undergoing.
Yeah, it's a difficult history, but the one thing that I didn't grow up understanding, but came to understand later, the idea that Poland for centuries was considered the safest place for Jews in the world because it had legal protections, constitutional protections for religious minorities and ethnic minorities, which was unusual. It didn't exist in Europe, except for in Poland, that had a very specific history of protection of individual rights, which is something that actually put it into conflict with Russia over the centuries and continues to. But yeah, the idea that, for centuries, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of years, Polish Catholics and Jews live side by side, not always without conflict, of course. They're human beings, but also with a lot of sort of intertwining of the communities. So yeah, it was very strange to come and make friends with people who had that history, who were Ashkenazi Jews from, in some cases, literally villages away from where my family came from. I mean, it was uncanny to actually figure that out, that some of my friends, their grandparents or great grandparents had grown up, like 15 kilometers away from my family, and that they had potentially crossed paths, in the market towns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So give us a brief history of the Polish diaspora in Canada in general and Montreal in particular.
Well, my connection is to the generation that came during or after the Second World War. But the Polish presence in Canada, like Ukrainian, like a lot of Central and Eastern European countries, dates back much, much further. But yeah, after the Second World War, there were very large waves of immigration, and a lot of Poles ended up coming to Montreal. I won't be able to show it to you because it's kind of blocked by a building right there, but I live quite close to a Catholic church here in Montreal, on St. Viator Street. And it's a Polish church, which was actually taken over from the Irish, who'd built it in the teens or 20s or something. But that church actually became like a very important hub for Polish refugees from Africa. So, you have these waves and waves of Poles coming after the war, settling in Montreal, which at the time was the biggest cosmopolitan city in Canada, the economic and sort of cultural hub of everything. And my family came here and ended up living in what's historically the red light district, basically down near the old port. And so within that community, you had, the majority of the people who came had fled or experienced German occupation. But you had this other significant minority who'd gone through or who were escaping, suppression from the Soviet Union or from Russia. And within that smaller community, you had an even smaller community, which were the ones who'd been deported to Siberia and managed to escape. And within that group, you had the very small number who'd actually ended up in Africa, like my family. So we have a family cottage not too far from here on the Vermont border. And it was actually 15 Polish families, all of whom had grown up together in Tanzania in the same refugee camp as my grandmother, who built like a little Polish village. And you have these places sort of dotted across the landscape in Quebec, Ontario, further west, in the prairies. I'm leaving in or in a few weeks to Calgary and Edmonton to show my film, because there are, big Polish communities there too. So yeah, they're sort of spread out across the country. But Montreal was, historically one of the big hubs of Polish immigration, which is good for me because I can still get like pierogi and Polish food right around the corner from my house, even though most of them are gone now.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I love Polish cuisine.
Yeah.
And I've lived in Canada for 4 years as an undergraduate. I went to
Okay.
Montreal twice. The
Yeah.
second time to visit the NFB film archives. But I've never visited Calgary, so I'd love a chance to visit, or even to like live there at some point, like if I
Mhm.
get a chance to go back. But yeah, I'm sure that the Polish people who remember being occupied by the Nazis will have like very different memories from those who were occupied or displaced by the Soviets.
Mhm. How so? I
Yeah,
mean, if
yeah.
go ahead.
I'm guessing that yeah. Whether that I don't know whether that's true, but yeah.
I mean, different forms of control and oppression. But I mean, at the time, it's important to remember both Nazi Germany and the USSR were totalitarian states, different forms. I mean, one was fascist, one was socialist, but both of these places were, trying to exert complete total control over life. One was ethnically based, like on these ideas of like, yeah, race and ethnicity, and the other was based on classic, the class system or economics. But yeah, so separate but similar. I think, for me, my grandfather's side of the family were in the Nazi concentration camps. My grandmother's side of the family ended up in the Soviet concentration camps. Their experiences might have been different day to day, but the trauma that it left, I think, is very similar in terms of like overnight, you're losing agency, you have no control over your future. You don't even have control over your own body. It doesn't belong to you anymore. I think that these things have, left very long tail traces. You still see it in generations, grandchildren, great grandchildren, the traces of these things. So yeah, the very different histories, but definitely overlapping.
Of
Yeah.
course. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, how do the generations of your grandmother remember their homeland when they think about it? When they think about it.
So for this film, I started filming around 2008, 2009, 2010. And I didn't realize at the time, but in retrospect, I was focusing on a really particular group of people. These were the people who were old enough to remember Poland. So they'd been born before the war and they'd grown to a certain age that they could, carry memories of the place they'd been born. But they were young enough that in 2010 or 2015, they were still around and able to tell me their life story. So, my grandmother had memories of growing up in a very rural community. She grew up on quite close to the Russian border, the Soviet border, farming community, extended family. Probably 50 members of the family lived in a farming settlement. And they were working the land. They were agricultors. They were farmers. Like many of the people who ended up there, they had connections to the military. My great grandfather had fought in the Polish Bolshevik War and the First World War, but they purchased the land, so they bought the land that they ended up taking. But a lot of Polish families who ended up deported were given the land as military settlers. So yeah, I mean, yeah, the question was about their memories of Poland.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
how they think about it today, basically.
yeah, how they think about it today, it's interesting because I mean, like my grandmother never stepped foot in Poland again, right? And her memories were of a rural farming community. So she never lived in a Polish town. Really, the biggest Polish town she ever lived in was a refugee camp in Tehran, and then in the village in Tanzania in Tengeru. 5,000 people in the refugee camp. So, their connections to Poland were often very not tenuous, but they were, a lot of them were coming from rural communities.
Um, so just a quick personal question. Is your grandma
Grew up.
still with us?
No, she passed away in 2012.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
while I was in the film.
I see. Well, may her rest in peace.
Yeah, thank you.
Um,
Uh, yeah,
so yeah, I'll probably ask the same question that your professor McGill asked you. So Polish people in Africa and of course in
yeah.
Iran. So how did that happen?
To go back to, I mean, the start of it is sort of, it feeds off of what I was just talking about, which is Polish settlers who ended up in the eastern borderlands, Kresy, as it's called. So Poland was partitioned off of the map in the late 1700s. Last partition was in 1795, meaning that Poland didn't actually exist as a country, on the map for 123 years. After World War One, collapse of the Russian Empire, the rise of the Bolsheviks, but the descent into civil war, Germany, sort of collapsing because of the First World War. Poland is created on the map again. There's a war between Poland and most of its neighbors, actually, but there's a war between Poland and the USSR that ends up eventually with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with a large chunk of the eastern borderlands being added to Poland, territory that didn't actually have a lot of ethnic Poles in it. So it was Lithuanians in the north, Belarusians in the middle, and Ukrainians in the south. And a lot of families ended up, moving to these territories. There were incentives, especially for military families, to go and build homes there. They wanted to sort of secure the border region from the USSR. And then, the prelude to the Second World War, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. There's a secret protocol, part of this treaty between Nazi Germany and the USSR, where the Nazis and the Soviets agree essentially on a demarcation line in an occupied Poland, theoretically occupied Poland that was about to happen. So the idea was that, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union sort of agreed to the division of Poland, where to divide it. So the entire eastern part went to the Soviet Union, or was taken by the Soviet Union, and they ended up deporting somewhere between 400,000 and a million people in 4 waves of deportations between February 1940 and June 1941. The first deportation, February 1940, was the biggest, and it's also the one that my family was taken away in. And they were going, for military families, for the professional class, landowners, but also forestry workers, engineers, people who could help with the industrialization of the Soviet Union. So the idea was, we're not just going to take the men and get rid of them because they're a problem. We're going to take entire families. We're going to take entire villages. We're just going to take all of these people, to Siberia, which is what happened. So they deported, up to a million people starting in February 1940, and loaded them onto trains and, sent them off to the Arctic under horrible conditions. I mean, it was the middle of winter. They weren't really given any food, no toilets. A lot of people ended up dying on that first wave of deportations. So it was brutal. It was a really horrible history. And then they ended up staying, in either in gulags proper, like prison camps, or in work camps, which is where my family ended up. So they ended up in a forestry camp. Oh, you're frozen for a sec.
Oh yeah, I think you did too. But yeah, I think we were cut off with the fact that there were forestry camps, and your grandparents were.
I'm just gonna add my phone here to hotspot it, just in case it's my connection.
Yeah. So forestry camp.
Yeah, so they had the Poles set up basically in camps across not just Siberia proper, but northern Russia, which is to say west of the Urals, but really all across the breadth of the Soviet Union. I mean, they were everywhere from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, right through to Vladivostok. But in my family's case, they were working in a forestry camp in northern Russia.
Yeah. So, alluding to the film's title, do you suppose are some of the biggest discrepancies between, history as written in the books and history as remembered and told by, people like your grandmother?
You studied philosophy?
Yes, but not in a degree credential kind of way. But I've taken philosophy classes, and I have read a lot of philosophy texts.
Right. So obviously Aristotle, but Aristotle delineated, made the distinction between poetic truth and historical truth, right? And he said that historical truth, of course, it has its value, but poetic truth can actually be more truthful and more valuable because it contains different it contains a potential in it to, in the case of my family, the memories that my grandmother and the other survivors had were factual and true to their lives, but they were very much informed by their emotional experience of it. And over time, the details kind of shifted and changed a little bit. They, even within my own grandmother's stories, sometimes the facts would change somewhat, but there was like a deeper poetic truth to it. There was like an emotional human truth that I was always really fascinated by, which I found again and again across the survivors. So that even if they forgot the little details, they were speaking about a shared myth between all of these people. And I think one of the things I'm really interested in and preoccupied by is the idea of the mechanics of erasure, right? What is it, what takes place and what is the process by which a people can be erased, starting from rhetoric and language right through to the actual destruction and, physical genocide of the people. And I think that in my family's case and the hundreds of thousands of Poles who went through this, as well as Balts and Ukrainians and others, is that there was a deliberate effort to erase their history and to erase their narrative control over who they were, where they came from, and what their story was about. And I think that the way that my grandmother told her stories, she was an excellent storyteller. I was lucky that she was telling stories. Not all of the grandparents did, but she was able to convey something to me that was much deeper than just the facts of what she'd been through. And it took me a long time to sort of understand what that was, because it wasn't about, it wasn't just about the details of what they'd been through. It had something to do with dignity and humanity. So yeah, I think in that sense, the stories that they told were closely connected to the facts, but there was also something a bit deeper. And I try to capture that with the title of the film, connecting the physical and the symbolic, basically.
Yeah. So I'm asking this because this year I believe celebrates or commemorates the 80th anniversary of the Holocaust. And Holocaust survivors are dying out. So that source of oral history is disappearing. And
Mhm.
as that source of oral history disappearing, we as a collective people seem to forget what led to that atrocity to begin with. And
Yeah.
we risk, perpetuating the same kind of causes that led to that tragedy. So I think it's certainly something to be concerned about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the same things that happened in the past are sort of are coming true again. I think we're forgetting the lessons of that time. You see a lot of the same patterns of dehumanization taking place that took place back then, justified by people's sense of grievance or victimization. All these things these emotional states that are kind of exploited by malevolent actors to get people to act against their own self-interests and, to target others. But yeah, I think unfortunately I feel very fortunate. I mean, really lucky to have had the chance to meet so many survivors over the years, to have those stories in person.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, Nietzsche, in one of my favorite writings of his titled "The Use of and Abuse of History," where he may not be alluding to what we're talking about, but he's getting into the fact that the fact that history is, in his view, is not a collection of events that's being recorded and kept for posterity, but an abstract phenomenon that is, well, used and abused by people for political gain. And
Mm.
so, how do we prevent from happening?
How do we prevent the abuse of history?
Yeah, or the misuse of it.
The misuse of history. I mean, for me personally, it's located in empathy. It's in teaching people how to, remain radically open to the other. That's not an easy thing to do, especially when we're incentivized, through technology, through media, through all this messaging. We're incentivized to dehumanize others, and in the process, we dehumanize ourselves, I find. But I think maintaining the connection to other human beings, building trust. Like you don't need to go out there and befriend everybody in the world, but start within your community, start with the people in your world. And yeah, I think that somehow giving people personal connection to those histories and emotional connection to it is very important. Also doubt, I think, teaching people or putting doubt into people's minds about these, sort of sloganized versions of history or of what's going on with politics today. I think, taking the emotion out of the conversation, having really logical conversations with people, taking people at their word when they say things that are completely preposterous, and just asking them, well, if that's true, then what about this? I think that for me personally, one of the things that drove me to go to Ukraine was to see this process taking place in real time, right? And I had gone through the experience in making that last film where I was piecing together the little fragments of history that still existed, but the history had been erased deliberately. Like the Soviet Union erased the history of the deportations. They bulldozed the villages that a lot of these people were from. They changed the names of the places. But what's happening today is actually the opposite problem, which is that there's almost too much information. So the atrocities that are taking place, in Bucha or in Mariupol, there's no lack of evidence. There's no lack of images and stories to prove what happened and who did it. But the surplus of information and of images is being used to actually create sort of epistemic chaos and confuse people as to what happened, right? And I've personally experienced this, having gone to some of these places like Bucha, and then coming back to Canada, and people who've never stepped foot in Eastern Europe, let alone gone to those places, trying to, questioning the truth of what people told me in person in those places. How do you know they're telling you the truth when they say that, the Russians perpetrated those massacres? Meanwhile, they're sitting on Twitter believing something that's completely ephemeral and digital. So I think, yeah, the connection to empathy and to the human being is very important. Like the openness to sitting down and actually, deferring to somebody else's humanity. You can't make people do that, but I think it's it's sort of the only path to reconnect people to radical tenderness and empathy.
So yeah, and if I can allude to your upcoming project about Ukraine too, what I certainly hope that the project, which I'm excited to see, will do is that it sort of jump started a discussion on what's going on in Ukraine. Hopefully when it's produced, like things will have simmered out a little bit, but. I think after 3 years, the fact that Ukraine is fading from the news cycle is also happening concurrently at the same time as more and more people starting asking questions like, why do we even care about Ukraine? We haven't cared about Ukraine before.
Mhm.
And I wonder if that is something that you're concerned about.
I mean, of course, I have a very personal connection to those places. It's difficult to, like this morning, open the news and hear about an attack on Kharkiv, which is a place that I've spent a lot of time in and where I have close friends. So I know that my attention, or the attention I pay to it, is going to be different than people who haven't been there, who don't have those relationships. But one of the things that really struck me from my first experiences, my first weeks in going to Ukraine, was how open people were, how open of a society it was. Of course, it has its problems, that are discussed elsewhere, but the people in and of themselves, they really value the concept of freedom and the concept of dignity. And I think that, if you hear a lot of disinformation about the 2014 Maidan ousting of Yanukovych.
Yanukovych. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll see there's a really concerted effort by certain people to disparage the Maidan revolution, and to say that it was external actors that did it and perpetrated it. But really, when you actually go and talk to people on the ground, you understand that what they were fighting for was dignity. They were fighting for the right to live in a free society. And they understand that corruption and oligarchic control of government is what results in people losing freedom and dignity, which we see playing out to our south in the United States right now. There's like a effort to take over and change the society. But I think that, yeah, for me, that's what I'm trying to do, is figure out ways to make that conversation relevant again. And I think as a Canadian, now that we're going through this talk about 51st state and the border is invisible, the border is, doesn't exist. We're going to be a cherished state, the United States. Like it's almost word for word the same talk you heard on Russian state TV towards Ukraine. It's the diminishment of not just of sovereignty, but of the very existence of a place. It's a form of yeah, erasure. So it's very dangerous. So yeah, it's difficult to see that story fall from the front pages, but I think it's a very important battleground. It's something much larger that's taking place.
Certainly. Yeah. And as an aside, would you like to clear the record on what happened in Ukraine in 2014?
In 2014, in terms of the Maidan revolution,
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Because
mean,
yeah, I've heard a lot of like differing views on what happened too. Like people say that it's a some sort of US backed coup or something like that.
yeah, right. Because the at the time, Ukraine was negotiating a deal with the EU, which the president Yanukovych, who had very close ties to Russia and who has since, gone into exile in Russia, the president of Ukraine basically quashed the deal at the last minute and went to sign a deal with Russia instead, which caused a huge backlash amongst large chunks of the population. And, people saw the future of the country sort of being taken away from them against their will without any discussion or referendum or anything. So, there started to be protests in the center of Kyiv, which eventually led to violence and protesters being shot, which eventually led to Yanukovych himself being pushed out and going into exile in Russia. I mean, the politics, like the politics and geopolitics, are complicated of all of these things. But I think to me, what's important is when you go and talk to people on the ground, people who were at Maidan, they're very clear on what they were standing for, and they were very clear about what they're standing against, which is they didn't want this sort of like corrupt outside influence over their politics. They wanted the people to be able to decide. And I think as a principle and as a value, that's something that we stand for here in Canada. So yeah, but I do hear a lot of disinformation from people. Typically here, it's from people who have, again, zero connection to Eastern Europe. They don't know anything about the history. They don't know anything about the gulags or Russia's tendency to invade its neighbors. They dismiss all of this very important history and context, and they just reduce it down to, politically convenient talking points. Somewhere here I have my book of George Orwell I was just reading, Notes on Nationalism.
Yeah.
It gets into it, but yeah, I mean that's it for me. It's about that. You have to, if you're going to tell people that their revolution wasn't a revolution, it was a coup, then you should make the effort to actually talk to those people. And I haven't seen that happen amongst anyone who's actually brought up that talking point. It's always just a political point. It's never informed of any conversations with actual human beings or participants in the revolution.
So, yeah. So
Yeah.
finally, to allude to the question or the topic that you raised at the beginning of our dialogue, having learned about Polish and Ukrainian history, I can certainly see there's a similarity between the volunteers in the war on the side of Ukraine and the Polish underground resistance in 1944 in the
Mhm.
Warsaw Uprising. So, are you closer to having an answer to the question of why do people risk their, not just their self-interest, but even their lives to, causes that they believe in?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's very individual on the one hand. I think a lot of people, it's their particular, life story that brings them to do it. One thing I found right from the first days when I arrived in Poland was that I was surrounded by people who came from similar contexts from me, even if they were very different histories. Meaning, I was meeting people from Georgia. I was meeting, Ukrainians. I was meeting Russians as well, Russian Americans. I was meeting, people like in the film, like in Jesse Eisenberg's film, whose grandparents had been, in the concentration camps. So like American Jews or something. So I was meeting people who came from like similar perspectives or backgrounds. Like they understood that what was happening today was connected to what had happened to their families in the past or what was going on in their countries today. So I don't know. I think human beings will always, deep down, there'll always be some of us who are going to yearn for something more than what we're given. And who are going to push back against, constricted forms of government that limit people's freedom and liberty. I don't have an easy answer, but I do know that, I think a lot about the idea of cynicism, the concept of cynicism, what it is, what its history is. And something I find really interesting is that the word itself, cynicism, means the opposite of what it originally did, right? In ancient Greece, the school of the cynics was teaching human virtue, and the path to human virtue being to eschew material goods and social climbing, and to just stay connected and rooted in one's human nature. And Diogenes of Sinope, a very famous philosopher, was kind of like the original punk rocker of Western philosophy. Was very famous for like these little kind of like almost art performances he would do, like walking around Athens with a lamp in the middle of the day, and people would say like, Diogenes, what are you doing? Why do you have a lamp? It's like, I'm looking for an honest man, and but there's I bring him up because there's a specific thing. Like he's known for a conversation with Alexander the Great, where Alexander comes to see Diogenes, because he's fascinated by this man, and says, Diogenes, I'm Alexander, the king of kings. Like, I will grant you a wish. What do you want? And Diogenes says, can you please get out of my light? You're blocking the sun. Something like a complete disregard for power and power dynamics. In that moment, Diogenes is seeing himself equal to, this conqueror, this king. And I think that there's something in that for me that's very important. The idea of the original meaning of cynicism, of finding worth and, self-worth and virtue in oneself, and then trying to come back to that understanding of what it means. Whereas today we live in an age that is taken on the opposite meaning, where cynicism, is every dog is out for himself. Like, he's going to grab your piece of bread before you do, so you better get it. And I think that that's why there's actually a tremendous opportunity that I think over time is actually going to become more apparent to people, that there's an openness for us to actually stand up for something beyond transactional self-interest. But we'll see. Time will tell. But I can say that I saw it and have seen it and have continued to see it in Ukraine, where people are standing up for something more than personal gain. They're standing up for principles and values rooted in dignity and common decency. So that to me is very important to see and to document.
Of course. And on that great note, thank you very much, Jonathan Durand, for joining the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.